Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to the Fall 2016 Honors Colloquium. I'd like to begin by welcoming Dr. David Dooley, President of the University of Rhode Island, to say a few words.
Thank you, Lynn, and it's great to see everybody here for the 2016 Honors Colloquium. Usually these welcoming remarks, particularly at the first event of the colloquium, are given by the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs, Don DeHaze, to whom the Honors Program, of course, reports. But tonight, I sent Don to a meeting with the Finance and Facilities Committee for the Council on Higher Education, and I said I would substitute for him. And it's truly a pleasure to be with you all. This is the 8th Honors Colloquium since I became president of the University of Rhode Island in 2009, and they have all been splendid, distinctive, and frequently inspiring as well as challenging. The recent honors colloquia that we've had here have focused, and I'll sort of give them oldest first, 2009, starting there, was on India, followed by a colloquium on race, then one on Are You Ready for the Future, healthcare, public schools, cybersecurity and privacy, the power of humor, and this year, of course, we're here to talk about inequality and the American dream. And I know the organizers, Jill Dorner, Kristen Johnson, Eric Loomis, and Leah Malloy, who put this together, did so with great forethought and anticipation of what would be particularly relevant and timely now in 2016. But I doubt they could have anticipated just how important this topic would be to America at this moment in our history and in our culture and in our politics. To think deeply and broadly about what does the American dream mean in the 21st century, who can have a part of that dream, and how do we deal with the vast gulfs of inequality that now exist in our nation, probably of unprecedented scope and scale. Those are some of the questions that we'll take up over the course of the semester in this colloquium and in the honors classes in which the students participate. And I'm looking forward to it a great deal, as I'm sure all of you are too. And I think it is timely and important for us to come together around these kinds of topics as a community here at the University of Rhode Island, a community that's dedicated to equity, diversity, and inclusion, a community that believes strongly in the reality of the American dream, and as one of America's land-grant universities, we are one of the primary engines that drive the successful attainment of the American dream, not just for our citizens right now, but for those who will come or move here after us or after this evening. So thank you all for joining us. We look forward to a fantastic evening, and I thank Lynn Derbyshire for giving me this opportunity just to share a few thoughts with you.
I'm Lynn Derbyshire, the Director of the Honors Program, and again, I welcome you to the Fall 2016 Honors Colloquium. The Honors Program at the University of Rhode Island gathers together a community of scholars, scientists, and artists to provide intellectual excitement and reward to all participants, student, faculty, and the public. We develop courses that feature critical, creative, and integrative thinking and offer students opportunities to broaden their intellectual development. We also provide pre-professional advising for students in the health professions and for students competing for nationally and internationally competitive scholarships and fellowships. And for over a half a century, we have coordinated the Honors Colloquium. The colloquium focuses each year on a topic of current public interest. This year, inequality in the American dream. As the President noted, it is a most timely topic, and I'm confident that it will productively contribute to the public conversation around these issues. Producing a series of this scope requires the work and the financial assistance of many people and groups, and you will see them listed on our flyer. In addition, the colloquium coordinators have been working on this program for well over a year now. They are Dr. Jill Dorner from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and the Interim Director of Criminology in the Criminal Justice Program. Dr. Kristen Johnson from the Department of Political Science. Dr. Liam Malloy from the Department of Economics. And Dr. Eric Loomis from the Department of History. And they have done a remarkable job of designing both this program and the accompanying course. And let me make a personal thanks to Dr. Rick McIntyre, without whom this really would not have happened. And he is the prior director of the Honors Colloquium. Although she does not appreciate it, I will also thank Deb Gardner, the coordinator for the University Honors Program, who without whom this does not happen. Thank you, Deb. And as always, the continuing support of President David Dooley and President Donald D. Hayes is critical to our success. Okay, a couple of quick housekeeping notes. For your safety, note that there are exits from the building on either side of the stage. I feel like a flight attendant. And where you entered in the back. And let me also note there is a ramp for handicap access on the door that goes to Upper College Road. Restrooms are located in the lobby and on the basement level. I ask that everybody turn off their cell phones for the duration. And now Dr. Kristen Johnson will introduce our speaker.
I have the honor of introducing Dr. Victoria De Francesca Soto as the first speaker of the 2016 Honors Colloquium. And I'm particularly delighted to introduce her because I've known her for well over a decade. We were in graduate school at the same time, and were on the very difficult political science job market at the same time, and I've had an opportunity to follow her career and her trajectory over that period of time, and so I'm fortunate to call her a friend. But she was tremendously successful in her early academic career, completing a PhD at Duke University with an initial academic appointment and a number of publications. She started at Northwestern University and studied and published extensively on electoral behavior and how the growth of Latino populations impacts a variety of societal and regional sectors along political, social, and economic lines, and so really critical issues. And she had a tremendous trajectory in an academic context as a predominant and important scholar. But instead of taking just that path, she opted to take every path, which is really unusual for academics. She decided to engage in both scholarship and in the public sphere in a way that we really rarely see in contemporary academia. And she's done so highly effectively. She is currently at the University of Texas at Austin and teaches in the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies and is a fellow at the Center for Politics and Governance at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. She works with a variety of professional organizations and has done so extensively for quite a long period of time, including the board of the Hispanic Caucus Chairs. And most recently, if you've seen her face or heard her voice, it is probably on MSNBC as a contributor, or her work that you may have read at NBC.com. And she also served as an analyst for Telemundo during the recent conventions. And so she's really engaged across a variety of spheres in an active and enlightened way. Immigration and inequality are really difficult topics to grapple with under the best of circumstances, and during this electoral cycle, they're even more difficult. We have often fairly intransigent perspectives that are mutually exclusive, that aren't speaking to each other about these kinds of topics. And a complex history undergirds the issue of immigration in our society. We're a nation of immigrants, but we have really contradictory feelings about that and the execution of it. One of the strengths of Victoria's work, and one of the real appeals for her in this position and in her commentary, is that she approaches these issues from a personal perspective that acknowledges and humanizes the engagement of a variety of perspectives and really encourages a dialogue between competing positions. And I think often in these sorts of discussions, it's very difficult to reach those kinds of perspectives. And so I am delighted to turn the floor over to Victoria De Francesca Soto to speak to you about inequality and the American dream and the issue of immigration.
Thank you, Kristen, and I am also lucky to call Kristen my friend. Thank you all for being here today, except that I don't see my notes. As I walk over here, I'm just gonna grab my notes. Thank you for taking time out of your evening to come here tonight. Thank you, President Dooley and Lynn, for being such gracious hosts. And thank you, Nelly, for coming out. You're Secretary of State, that one of my areas of expertise is Latina politics, and she is a trailblazer. You guys are lucky to have her. So I want to start off with a question, even though I'm supposed to be doing the talking, but I want to see by a show of hands. How many of you here are immigrants or the descendants of immigrants? Okay, that's about what I expected. I myself am in that category. I am the daughter of a Mexican immigrant and the great-granddaughter of Jewish and Sicilian immigrants. So the Feingolds and the DeFrancescos came over in the late 1800s, coming through Ellis Island, and Victoria Soto crossed the US-Mexico border just a couple of decades ago. So you've got Jewish, Sicilian, Mexican. Sounds like the beginning of a bad joke. All immigrants. So that ties them together, but the real bond that ties all of these disparate traditions and cultures and languages together were that these folks came over and made those journeys because they were pursuing the American dream. An American dream that they wanted for themselves, but really what drove them was that they wanted that American dream for their children, for their grandchildren, for me, so that I could be here tonight speaking to you. The same reason that your ancestors came, whether it was recently or very long ago, so that you could be here today as well. Immigration is probably one of our deepest common denominators as a nation. Yet, at the same time, it is one of the dimensions that most profoundly divides us. And it's always been this way. It's not unique to this 2016 election cycle or to Trump. That being said, the focus on immigration is on the high end. You know, immigrant groups, Latinos recently, the business community, they're always paying attention to immigration. But this year, Donald Trump has widened it And he's made it a major issue for everyone. And he's done this by linking immigration to bad things. He's linked it to crime, to rapists. He's linked it to drugs. He's linked it to unemployment and inequality, and most recently, to terrorism. And are there some very bad people who happen to be immigrants? Yes. But see, these are a couple of bad apples in a barrel of tens of millions. In the Trump worldview, restricting immigration, essentially closing borders, is a solution. That's what is going to make America great again. But you've got to admit that it's ironic, that given that what has defined us as a country since the beginning is that we are a country of immigrants. Just this morning on CNN, Governor Cuomo refused to scapegoat immigrants and to call on targeting Muslim immigrants. And he said plainly, we're a country of immigrants, and if we do that, they win. We are a melting pot. That is what is American and what makes us great. And funny enough, if there's one group that thinks that we're already great, it's immigrants. More than half of Latinos and Asians, so the biggest immigrant groups in our country right now, were asked about the American dream. And over half of these survey respondents said, you know, if you work hard, you will persevere, you will succeed in this country. When you look at blacks and whites, that drops down about 10 percentage points. And let me give you a really stark contrast. This is from a survey question that was asked from the Washington Post Miller Center survey from 2 years ago. It says, what do you think is more likely over the next few years in terms of your social class? Will you move up or will you slip backwards? Among white respondents, only 36% said move up. Among Latinos, 57% said move up. Recent immigrants, and immigrants in general, infuse optimism into our country. They are pushing us to keep the faith, even when we're slipping back, to keep the faith in the American dream. But they also do some more concrete things. Latinos, Asian immigrants, immigrants from across the country innovate. Look at the entrepreneurship profile of this country. And whether we're talking about Google or Amazon, so your Google CEO, Google founder, or whether you're talking about the opening up of small businesses, I don't know, let's say small taco trucks on every corner. I couldn't help myself. I had to put it in. I'm sorry. So there's the entrepreneurship, the economic perspective, and then there's also just the numbers themselves. Because among whites, we're not seeing a population rate, a birth rate that replaces itself. 1.8 for every woman, non-Hispanic white woman, in her lifetime will have 1.8 children. Well, in order to replace ourselves, we need 2, minimum 2. Latinas have the highest birth rate in our country at 2.4. So because of the sheer numbers from our immigrant communities, Social Security is going to remain solvent. Our workforce will continue to expand. We will have people to pay into the system and, quite bluntly, to take care of us when we're old and we need somebody to be there. So does targeting the immigrant, or advocating restrictive immigration really solve the problems our country face. And yes, we are facing monumental problems. You can probably guess what my short answer is. And I promise I will elaborate on the longer answer of how we can balance sensible immigration, decreasing inequality, and making sure that the American dream remains alive and well for all. But before I do, I want to give us some historical perspective for immigration. Because in order to know where we're going, we need to know where we've been. For about the first 100 years, the US had no immigration policy. The Constitution is all but silent on the issue of immigration. The implicit immigration policy of this country was one of open arms, completely open arms. Then in 1875, we see the first restriction. So the immigration law of 1875 bars prostitutes and criminals from coming. How you could tell that, I don't know, but who am I to question? And then not long after, we see the Chinese Exclusion Acts of the 1800s. This is really pivotal in understanding our history and understanding immigration and the dynamics in this country, because you have economic threat arguments, essentially concerns about inequality, economic threat, cloaked in racial arguments. These gain political traction. Chinese immigrants are, I quote, devious and shifty. They are after the white man and are only to be engaged in illicit activities and found in opium dens. Sound familiar? Linkage of drugs, criminality, immigrants. This is from the 1800s. The Chinese exclusion initiated and legitimated state capacities for restricting immigration on ethnic and racial bases. A little factoid, one of my fun cocktail hour factoids. The US Border Patrol that was established in the 1900s was not established to keep Mexicans from crossing the border. They could care less about Mexicans. The Border Patrol was established to keep the Chinese from coming in from Mexico into the United States. So you would have Chinese immigrants coming through the Sea of Cortez, trying to come up through Baja or through Sonora, or coming in through the coast, through the Gulf Coast. So Asian immigration is essentially halted. But European immigration continues to boom. During its peak, 500,000 to over 1 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island every year. That translates into about 5,000 to 10,000 immigrants a day. For those of you who haven't been to Ellis Island, I highly recommend it. But following World War I, we see an isolationist and anti-immigrant mood take hold of our country. More specifically, we see an anti-immigrant mood directed toward a certain type of immigrants, Eastern European and Southern European, my folks, the Feingolds, the DeFrancescos. These immigrant groups were subject to very hateful speech and to violence. The largest lynching in the history of US politics took place in New Orleans, and it was a group of 9 Sicilian immigrants. So these Italian immigrants were charged with murder. They were tried and found not guilty. Yet the lynch mob nevertheless went, dragged them out of their cell, and hung them in the courtyard. What's perhaps most disturbing was the reaction by society at large. The editorial response in the New York Times from 1891 referred to the victims as, quote, sneaking and cowardly Sicilians, the descendants of bandits and assassins. See, What was happening at the time was that these racist sentiments were being justified by science. Given the concerns of immigration, the Dillingham Commission was tasked by Congress to look into immigration, to understand it. Who are these people that are coming over? It was an 11-volume report, and I'm going to give you the take-home. That Eastern European and Southern Europeans, in addition with African Americans, of course, just had innate mental and physical deficiencies. This was elaborately couched in the science of eugenics, which regrettably lasted decades too long. And because of these findings, our country went ahead and established the quota laws of the 1920s. So, turning off the faucet for the waves of immigrants who were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. It wasn't until World War II that we began to see an aperture. Foreign policy reasons and trying to be a good neighbor during the Cold War, domestic reasons, immigration was, labor and immigrant rights activists had found some middle ground, and JFK embraced his immigrant past and incorporated it into the 1960 Democratic platform. Well, let's fast forward. 1964. President Lyndon B. Johnson is in the White House, and he is putting together the Great Society. And as part of the Great Society, he includes a reform on immigration. In the lead up to its passage, Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General at the time, argued that, in reference to immigration, everywhere else in our national life we have eliminated discrimination based on one's place of birth. Yet this system, the quota system, is still the foundation of our immigration law. So once the Hart-Celler Act was passed, it celebrated its 50th anniversary last year, it was a watershed moment for immigration, and also for civil rights more generally in our nation. It abolished the quota system based on racial and ethnic criteria. Instead, what it did is it built our modern immigration system on reuniting families, attracting skilled labor, and letting in refugees. The Hart-Celler Act reshaped our country in a number of ways. To begin with, the sheer numbers. In the last 50 years since the passage of this act, 59 million immigrants have come to this country. To put that into perspective, that is more than all of the previous European waves balled up. Today, 14% of our population is made up of immigrants. The Hart-Celler Act also had a drastic effect on who came. Prior to 1965, immigrants were from Europe. They're of European descent. After 1965, we saw a majority, 51% of immigrants coming from Latin America, a quarter from Asia, and most of the rest from Africa and Eastern European countries. The Hart-Celler Act was a massive and complex reform. It addressed flaws from our earlier system, and I firmly believe it was the right policy for the time. But policy is not static. 50 years removed from the Hart-Celler Act, we find ourselves at a juncture of needing another reform. There have been negative unintended consequences from the Hart-Celler Act and subsequent immigration reforms. There have been economic pressures, the Great Recession, and there have been shifts in industry and technology. 50 years is a long time. And I think if there is one thing that Republicans and Democrats can agree on, is that something needs to be done about immigration, that it's broken. The question is how. Lately, you turn on any channel and the media back and forth is about walls, or it's about mass deportation. And as someone who grew up from the border, I grew up 20 minutes from the border, and I live in a border state now. I can tell you that the idea of a wall is just plain silly. I mean, first of all, there are already hundreds of miles of fence along the US-Mexico border. A big chunk of the border is water, the Rio Grande. And in Arizona, between Arizona and Sonora, a large swath of that borderland region is a binational Indian reservation of the Tohono O'odham people. And if all of that weren't enough, there are these things called tunnels. Yes. And Mexicans have gotten very good at building them. Let's just ask El Chapo. But then there's the idea of, well, let's just deport everyone. Let's just deport 12 million people. And every time I hear this, I smile to myself because I think of this indie movie that was made a couple of years ago called A Day Without a Mexican, where California wakes up and suddenly all of the Mexicans have disappeared, you know, kind of this funky play on illegal alien, and you can imagine the mayhem that ensues in the movie. But let's be serious. Let's engage in that thought experiment. What would happen if everyone were deported? And then let's look at the cost. Let's just look at dollars and cents. We have had different organizations, different think tanks, crunch the numbers. And if we were to deport everyone, 12 million people, it would cost upwards of $5 billion. So there's that effect. And then just in the first year, our economy would shrink by at least 2%. And then you see that growing exponentially the following years. Talking about walls and mass deportation and shutting people out is sensational and it's headline grabbing, but it's not practical. It's a non-starter. At its core, immigration is about push and pull factors, understanding that. And push factors will always exist. The daily minimum wage of most countries is less than the hourly minimum wage of the United States. Mexico just raised its minimum wage this year to 73 pesos, translated into about $4.30 a day. So we're not going to be able to do too much on the push factors. I mean, maybe a little, but I'm not going to get into that. But what we can do is address the pull factors. The demand by employers. Because if we do this, we will really address the issue of undocumented immigration in this country. Immigrants come to the United States because there are people that want to employ them. If there wasn't a demand, there wouldn't be a supply. Immigrants don't just come here because. They don't pick up and leave their parents, their children, their spouses, their culture, their food, risk their lives crossing the border to be unemployed. They come here because there are people who want to employ them. And this just, it's not a theory I'm espousing here. We know this. So during the Great Recession, we saw unemployment rates rise across the country, unemployment going up. And as a result, there wasn't that demand. So Mexican immigration fell, and it kept falling to the point where we have negative net migration from Mexico, meaning that there are more Mexicans going back than coming over. By addressing the pull factors, that demand by employers, we're also going to safeguard the immigrant themselves from unscrupulous employers. There are employers who take advantage of these individuals because they live in the shadows. So they don't pay them fair wages, or sometimes they don't pay them wages at all. They don't provide safe working environments, and worse. There's the case of Josefina Hernandez, a story that was profiled in a recent human rights report where she was a food processing worker outside of Philadelphia. Her supervisor kept making sexual advances toward her, ultimately raped her, and said to her, "You can't do anything about this. You can't tell anyone because I will have you fired and then deported." So this woman lived in fear for years until she was finally able to come forward. And the third thing that addressing the pull factor will do is it will give native-born workers a better opportunity to compete. I'm a fan of immigration. I believe in it. In terms of our economy, we see the numbers, the GDP, it helps our GDP. But at the individual level, things aren't always so rosy. So how can you tell a guy who lost his job at the poultry plant in North Carolina because there are immigrants who will work for lower wages than he does, that immigration is good for him and that it's good for the GDP when he can't put food on the table? So the unsexy solution to immigration, again, isn't walls, isn't deportation. It's ensuring that employers follow the law. By doing this, immigration levels can remain stable, immigrants have workplace protections, and native-born workers can compete. And in theory, this sounds very doable. In fact, we already have a program in place, E-Verify, that should stem the pool. E-Verify is a system where you're an employer, someone comes to you, they want a job, they give you some paperwork, and you run it through a database. And this database checks with the Department of Homeland Security and with the Social Security Administration, basically checking if you're here legally. It's a simple way to ensure that employers are following the law. But it's a voluntary program. The idea is a good one, help employers follow the law, and by extension, address illegal immigration. But then, putting aside the fact that it's a voluntary program, what about those employers who hire under the table? Or those employers who don't care about hiring illegal workers? And here is one of the biggest flat tires in our broken immigration system. A little background. The punishing of employers who don't follow immigration law didn't begin until 1986 under the Immigration Reform and Control Act. So prior to that, you'd have raids, but it was just kind of for show. The workers would leave, and then maybe a week or two later, those workers or other workers would come back. So the idea I'm trying to get across here is that this wink, wink, nudge, nudge idea of being able to hire undocumented persons was baked in to our economic system. It was baked into our workplaces. So, okay, the government in 1986 sets out to officially crack down. But good policy, poor execution. The resources were never put in place to, first of all, investigate and then, more importantly, prosecute illegal hiring practices. Then, aside from the anemic enforcement, is the cost of the fines themselves. They're not prohibitive. If you get caught hiring an undocumented worker, it's a couple $100s. It could go up from there if you get caught a second or a third time, and repeat offenses are quite common. But what if fines were exponentially higher the first go around? You know, maybe employers would think twice about trying their luck. And hey, I do live in the real world, and I do know that the business lobby is no shrinking violet, and that they have fought E-Verify, and that they have fought the sanctions. But if business doesn't want to see mass deportations or a ramp up of deportations, and by extension, a shrinkage of our economy, they're going to have to get on board. Focusing on the pull is how we address our broken immigration system in a way that is fair, effective, and cheap. By starting with the pull factor, other pieces will fall into place because immigration is a complex issue, and there are many moving pieces. But this is the cornerstone. It's a tremendously heavy political lift, but it's one that can happen and will happen. From a practical point, there's no alternative. The alternative is the status quo. And that's a terrible alternative, and one that is unsustainable in the long term. And from a historical point, we have seen similar junctures. Though we may go 2 steps forward and 1 step back, we do ultimately find compromise. Our country is one that is still fundamentally believing in its immigrant past and its immigrant roots. A Gallup poll from just last year finds that 65% of adult Americans support a pathway to citizenship for undocumented persons. 19% support a pathway to legalization. Only 14% want to see all undocumented immigrants deported. The political vitriol has skewed what our reality is. Our reality is that we are a nation of immigrants, and we will continue to be a nation of immigrants. And in my humble opinion, being a nation of immigrants is what has always made and will continue to make America great. Thank you.
Great, so thank you all for coming, and we have a few minutes, 15 minutes I'd say, that we can ask some questions. So Professor Loomis and myself will be walking around. If you have a question, just raise your hand and we will come by.
We have one up here too.
Oh, upstairs. We better go upstairs.
Can you speak loudly? That creates what?
That creates, it creates situations for urban communities. I'm from Providence, Rhode Island, where we have a massive immigration population, especially Dominican, so it kind of goes towards the Latinos and Hispanics. My question is regarding how do we deal with the fact that we have individuals coming from these other countries, but they don't really contribute to the society. So when they come here, they just take advantage of the resources and then they send back to their country, but they never invest into the community. I don't know how many times there's been a shooting that has occurred, willingness to call the police, or their willingness to protect their community because they don't feel as if they belong in that community. They don't feel as if they have any roots to that community. They feel as if their homeland is more of a community than the one they live in there. So what is happening is this perpetuation of the massive inequities and the disparities that exist in their society.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
I think, so 2 very interesting points from that comment. The first is, you're referring to remittances. So we have immigrants here who come to work in the United States and they send back money to their home country. In Mexico, the case I know best, I think it's top 3 or top 4 of Mexican GDP is remittances. Now, that is a problem for the United States. You know, why aren't you investing that money back? Well, a lot of that has to do because immigrants who are here fear that at any moment they're going to be deported. They are not going to be able to stay here. So they're sending money back, all of the money that they can send back, rather than investing it here. If they had legal status, would they still send back remittances? Yes, but a chunk of that would also stay here because they had stability and they had that confidence that they would be able to remain in the community and not suddenly disappear overnight. The second question, remittances, why don't they get involved in the community, engage with the community? One issue that has been very problematic for the Latino community is that of secure communities. So over the years, because of the issue of immigration, local police departments, local law enforcement task forces have been obligated to take on the role of ICE agents, take on the role of immigration agents. And yes, you, are breaking immigration law by being here, but in doing so, you're breaking apart the fabric of a community so that if someone wants to engage in the community and talk to the police and help report crimes, they're too scared because, everyone in the house is undocumented, or maybe the aunt who's visiting, her visa has expired, and there's this element of fear. And so that's why when there's talk of let's get tough on communities, let's do away with sanctuary cities, it's got to be secure communities or nothing, there are implications to that, implications especially for your urban centers where you have immigrant communities living amidst native-born communities. So it's not a panacea to say just security is good for all. Oh.
I just wanted to make a statement that, a lot of our, especially in the agricultural business, we would not have half the food in our supermarkets if it weren't for immigrants, because the people in this country will not work under those kind of conditions. And these business leaders who are practicing hiring illegals are criminals as far as I'm concerned. I welcome anybody into this country, but they must do it legally. That way, like the young man up there says, they don't have to be afraid because they're already made citizens, and they can get, take advantage of the resources we have in this nation. But we have families in Rhode Island. I mean, we had a senator in Rhode Island who lived in Hopkinton. I won't mention his name, but he's dead now. And he ran Chickadee Farms. And he hired all illegal Vietnamese people, and they lived in those cement-blocked chicken houses, and that's how they worked.
That's subhuman conditions.
It's a crime.
It is absolutely a crime.
It's a
and that's
crime.
why when I was outlining why we need to focus on the poll are exactly your points. Because we need to bring people out of the shadows. And by bringing people out of the shadows, a rising boat lifts all tides. So we're going to help the American worker, and we're also going to help the immigrant worker. The other item that isn't talked about is the need for migration reform for temporary visas, because there are a lot of immigrants who want to come here, make some extra cash, and then go home and be with their family. Go home and be where they are from. And so there is a need. I think we also need to bring people out of the shadows, but we need to figure out a sensible way to bring surplus agricultural workers when needed, and then allow them to go home and come back, and do so in a fair way and one that does not exploit immigrants, because there have been past programs that exploit immigrants, but also allow American-born individuals to compete.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. So on the theme of addressing the pull factor, the problem seems to me how to do that. You can't just throw a switch and have it happen. And maybe, have you thought about something where the employer gets some benefit from helping the immigrant that he wants to hire to get the legal papers, because that person is not going to have the legal papers immediately. There's some millions apparently who
12
don't.
At the low end.
12 million that don't, and we depend on them, and we need a mechanism that makes this transition so that and perhaps the employer could get some benefit somehow of helping them over a period of time, a short period of time, to get the appropriate papers. Are there any programs like that?
Well, so the idea has been, in order to do that, is to provide a pathway to legalization. So rather than putting the onus on the employer, say, okay, you have to walk your employees through the process is saying, as part of this comprehensive immigration reform, there are these people here, we're not going to spend $5 billion to deport them all, but let's put them on a path to legalization. Whether that's citizenship, whether it's just residency, whatever it is, but bring them out of the shadows. And so that's the idea. When you hear path to legalization and path to citizenship, it's exactly that. I mean, there are instances of some employers, if they've developed a very close bond to their employees, or this employee has a very particular skill, they can start the process of bringing that individual out of the shadows, but it's incredibly costly, involves a lot of lawyers and a lot of time. So the idea is a pathway to legalization.
I believe there's too many people in the country now. How does immigration help that situation?
Well, so that question has two parts. Who do you want to let in from here on out? The second part to immigration is, what do we do with what we have in front of us? So folks can differ. If we have too many people, and the cost-benefit analysis we do is, you know what? I think it's better that we deport everyone here because it's better for our country, then sir, that is your view. But the tougher question, and throughout the history of immigration reform, the toughest question is always, what are we going to do going forward? Who are we going to let in? And so this is where those conversations about immigrant work visas come in. That's where the idea of high-tech visas, low-skilled visas come in. So that's the toughest part. That's the head-scratcher. The what do we do with the folks here? Well, there's two really clear answers. And as we know from the political debate, there's a lot of disagreement. Either you send them back or you keep them here on a path to legalization. But the second question is the one that's going to drive what our country looks like from here on out.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions.
So you made the argument earlier that Latinos are more fertile, which is good for the economy through like Social Security and like taking care of older people. But I have absolutely no facts to back this up. But I feel like most immigrants are probably in low-class environments. So there's already problems of like overpopulation and poverty there. So wouldn't more fertility kind of hurt those areas more?
So the higher population rates among Latinos, so that's a fact. The other fact we have is that minorities, especially Latinos, tend to live in lower socioeconomic status environments. I am of the belief that socioeconomic status is not static, that these are the folks that want the American dream. Maybe they came here with nothing. Maybe their parents came here with nothing, but they're in the public schools, and they're learning, and then they come to the University of Rhode Island, and they get a degree, and then they better themselves. So it's quintessentially, for me, an understanding of the American dream. It's a fact. Your facts are right, but you're disregarding the upward climb that all Americans pursue, and especially immigrants, but also the institutional outlets that we have to do so to better ourselves, such as the place we are in here tonight.
I was wondering if we could go back to push factors, and
Yes.
I'm wondering if, are there a significant amount of Salvadorans, Guatemalans, and Hondureños that are indeed deserving of asylum that are coming into the country?
All right. I'm going to keep my political views out of the discussion tonight, but what I am going to say in light of push factors is a lot of the violence that is occurring in Central America has to do with gang violence, and a gang violence that is intimately related to drugs. And if you want to talk about push-pull factors, let's talk about drugs. So why does Latin America send drugs to the United States? Because there's a demand. So I think that when we think about the recent immigrant influx, the recent refugee issue from Central Americans, that we think long and hard about those push factors and what involvement directly or indirectly we have had in those push factors.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming, and especially thank our speaker, Dr. DeFrancesco Soto. So just a quick reminder, next week we have Professor Kimberly Crenshaw coming, and she's going to be talking about the role of both race and gender